The second phone call came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday. I was sitting in my home office, the one with the framed certifications I never bothered telling my family about, when my cell phone lit up with her name. Danielle Marsh, my former trainee. The woman who had, 48 hours earlier, handed me a memo on Brightstone Healthcare letterhead informing me that my new role within the merged organization would be filing coordinator, grade II. After 14 years. After I had built every vendor relationship, trained every junior staffer, and held every single system access code in my head like a second language, I watched the phone vibrate twice. Then a third time. I did not answer it. I want you to understand something before I go any further. This is not a story about revenge. I have turned it over in my hands enough times to know what it actually is. It is a story about what happens when someone spends a decade being told they are nothing by the people who were supposed to love them most, and decides, very quietly, to become something undeniable instead. My name is Renata Voss. At the time Danielle Marsh's call went unanswered, I was Senior Director of Integrated Care Operations at Brightstone Healthcare's Northeast Regional Hub. A position I had held for 11 months before the merger made my title temporarily invisible to everyone except the people who actually ran the building. I had spent the previous decade becoming exactly the kind of person you cannot replace with a memo, and on that Thursday night, watching Danielle's name glow on my phone screen, I felt something I had not expected to feel. I felt completely calm. Hello, everyone. Before I continue, if you have ever been told you would never amount to anything by someone who was supposed to believe in you, I want you to leave a comment below. Tell me what they said. Tell me how old you were. Tell me whether they ever found out they were wrong. I will read every single one. But to understand why that phone call meant what it did, why I sat in that chair and watched it ring and felt nothing but the steady certainty of someone who had already won, I have to take you back. 22 years back, to a kitchen table in Garrison Falls, New York, where my sister Claudette told me I was not smart enough for the life I was reaching for, and my mother sat across from her and did not say a word. I was 24 years old. I had just been accepted into the Health Systems Administration program at Carver University's School of Public Health. Full academic program, competitive cohort, one of 60 students admitted that year out of more than 800 applicants. I had worked 2 jobs to save the application fees and the first semester's deposit. I had asked my mother just once, and I want you to hear how carefully I had calculated that ask before I made it, for $11,000. That was the shortfall between my savings, my partial scholarship, and what the program actually cost for the first year. $11,000. She had it. I knew she had it because my father had left her the house in Garrison Falls free and clear, and she had refinanced it the year before for home improvements that mostly consisted of a new kitchen and a trip to Portugal with Claudette. We were sitting at that new kitchen table when I asked. Claudette put her coffee mug down and looked at me the way you look at someone who has said something embarrassing in public. You want to do what? She said. Health Systems Administration, I said. It's a graduate program. It leads to hospital operations management. I've already been accepted. Claudette looked at our mother. Our mother looked at her coffee. Renata, Claudette said, and she used the patient, explanatory voice she reserved for situations where she believed she was being generous. You barely got through your undergraduate degree. You took 4.5 years. You had to retake statistics twice. I retook it once, I said, and I passed. You passed with a C+. This is a graduate program, she said, at a competitive university. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what kind of people are in those programs? I understood exactly what kind of people were in those programs. I had already met several of them during the admitted students' weekend. I had driven 4 hours to attend in a car with a cracked windshield and no functioning heat. They were people exactly like me, except that some of them had parents who were putting down the $11,000 without being asked twice. My mother finally spoke. She said, I just think you should be realistic, sweetheart. That was all, 9 words. No anger, no cruelty, just the quiet withdrawal of belief from someone who could have chosen differently. Claudette nodded like our mother had settled something important. There are perfectly good administrative certificate programs at the community college, she said. You could do medical billing, dental office management, something practical. Medical billing. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, thank you for your time. And I stood up and I put my coat on, and I drove back to my apartment in 42-degree weather with a cracked windshield, and I did not cry until I was in the parking lot of my building, and even then I only let myself cry for 12 minutes because I had an early shift the next morning. The $11,000 never came. I know now, and I knew then, in the way you know things you are not yet ready to say aloud, that the money was not really the point. The point was the verdict. Claudette had delivered it and my mother had ratified it, and the family position on Renata Voss was now officially established. Not quite enough. Reaches too far should aim lower. I wrote down 3 things on a piece of paper that night. The name of the program, the name of the department chair at Carver, Dr. Winifred Osibonsu, whose work on integrated care coordination I had been reading for 2 years, and the words $11,000 with a line under them. I folded the paper and put it in my wallet. I kept it there for 7 years. The health insurance coverage question was the first thing I solved. It sounds mundane when I say it that way, but if you have ever tried to pursue a graduate program while working 2 jobs without employer-sponsored benefits, you understand that health insurance is not a background detail. It is a constant low-grade emergency. I was paying $312 a month for a bare-bones individual policy that covered almost nothing, which meant that every unexpected medical expense was a calculation. Do I pay this bill, or do I make this month's deposit toward tuition? I made the deposits anyway. That was the decision. Everything else negotiated itself around that fixed point. I enrolled in the Health Systems Administration program at Carver University in the January cohort, 8 months after my mother's kitchen table verdict, after I had spent those 8 months working as a scheduling coordinator at Millbrook Regional Medical Center during the day and doing data entry for a medical billing firm called Archway Solutions 3 evenings a week. I had closed the $11,000 gap myself. Not elegantly, not without cost, but completely. The first semester was the hardest thing I had ever done. I want to be honest about that, because this story is not useful to you if I sand the edges off. The coursework was rigorous in a way I had not fully anticipated. The quantitative policy analysis sequence almost ended me. I sat in Professor Alan Dresner's class for 8 weeks feeling like I was reading the material in a language I spoke but did not dream in. I could translate it, sentence by sentence, but the fluency wasn't there yet. I failed the first midterm. Not barely failed. Failed with a score that, when I saw it on the return paper, made me sit very still for several seconds before I could continue breathing normally. I almost called Claudette that night, not to ask for help. Just because she had predicted exactly this outcome and some part of me, in that moment, believed she had been right, I did not call her. I called Dr. Osibonsu's office instead and asked for a meeting. Dr. Winifred Osibonsu was 61 years old, department chair, and possessed of the particular quality I have since come to recognize in the best professionals I have worked with. She had no interest in being kind to you at the expense of being useful. She looked at my failed midterm and then she looked at me and she said, "You understand the material. You are not executing under time constraints. These are different problems with different solutions." She was right. She was completely right. I had been studying the material correctly and testing it incorrectly, and those are, as she said, different problems. She connected me with a study group she ran informally for students in the cohort who were strong on theory and weak on applied speed. 4 of us met every Sunday morning for the rest of that semester. By the final exam, I had recovered my standing in the course. By the end of the first year, I was in the top third of my cohort. I did not tell my family any of this. Claudette called twice that year, once in March, once in October. Both times she asked how the certificate program was going. I said fine. I did not correct her. The correction would have invited a conversation I was not yet ready to have, and I had learned something important from the kitchen table. That conversation would cost me energy I needed for other things. I graduated from the Health Systems Administration program at Carver University in May, 2.5 years after I enrolled, with a 3.71 GPA and a concentration in integrated care delivery systems. Dr. Osibonsu presented me with a departmental award for my capstone project, a 47-page analysis of care coordination failures in regional hospital mergers that, I would learn years later, she used as a teaching document in her graduate seminar for the next 3 cycles. My mother and Claudette were not at the graduation. I had not invited them. I had, however, told them I was graduating. That part matters to the story. I called my mother 2 weeks before the ceremony and told her the date and the time and the name of the auditorium. I was clear, I was specific. My mother said, "Oh, the certificate thing." And I said, "Graduate degree, Mom, Master of Science in Health Systems Administration." And there was a pause and she said, "Well, that's nice, honey. Claudette's getting her kitchen redone this month, it's been a whole thing." And that was the end of that conversation. I drove to the graduation alone. I sat with my cohort. When they called my name and I walked across the stage, the person who cheered loudest in that auditorium was a woman named Portia Delacroix Chambers, the wife of one of my study group colleagues, who had never met me before that morning, but who had apparently decided I deserved a proper celebration regardless. I thought about Portia Delacroix Chambers for a long time afterward, about the specificity of her generosity, about the way a stranger can sometimes see you more clearly than the people who have known you your whole life. I started at Millbrook Regional Medical Center as a full-time care operations analyst 6 weeks after graduation. This was not the ceiling, I want to be precise about that. This was the foundation. Entry-level, in the context of hospital operations management, means something different than entry-level elsewhere. I was 27 years old, I had a graduate degree in the exact field I was entering, and I was working inside a functioning regional hospital system where the data I needed to understand the industry was available to me every single day if I paid attention. I paid attention. My direct supervisor at Millbrook was a man named Gerald Tao, Director of Operations for the Central Division. Gerald Tao had 21 years of hospital administration behind him, a reputation for being difficult that I later understood to mean demanding, and an absolute intolerance for people who confused knowing a process with understanding a system. He assigned me to the vendor compliance audit in my 3rd month. This was not a prestige assignment. Vendor compliance audits involve reconciling contracts, usage records, and billing documentation across every department that purchases supplies or services. It is granular and methodical, and most people at my level treated it as administrative punishment. I treated it as the education it actually was. By the end of that audit, 6 months in, I knew the hospital's vendor relationships better than people who had been managing them for years. I knew which contracts were underperforming, which vendors were double billing on ancillary services, and which service agreements had renewal clauses buried in subsections that nobody had read since the original signing. I wrote a 43-page findings report and presented it to Gerald Tao on a Tuesday morning in February. He read it in front of me. He asked 4 questions. Then he said, "How long have you been here?" 8 months, I said. He nodded slowly. "You should have been doing this for 8 years, he said. "Get to work on the ICU supply chain contract. I want your analysis by the end of the quarter." That was the closest Gerald Tao came to a compliment, and I carried it with me like the piece of paper in my wallet. The ICU supply chain analysis led to a renegotiated contract that saved Millbrook Regional $340,000 in the first fiscal year. That number appeared in the hospital's internal performance report for that quarter. Gerald Tao submitted my name for the Operations Excellence Recognition at the annual staff convening in March. I was the youngest recipient in the program's 9-year history. I found out about the recognition on the same weekend Claudette called to tell me that she and her husband Marcus were buying an investment property in Scottsdale and that they had used, in her words, the money Mom had set aside to cover the down payment difference. She said this casually, the way you mention something that is already decided and therefore not a conversation. The money Mom had set aside. I was 31 years old, and I had just saved my employer $340,000, and my family had used the money that might once have helped me to buy my sister a vacation property. I said, "That sounds like a great opportunity for them." Then I hung up and I looked at the recognition plaque Gerald Tao had ordered for me and I thought, they have no idea what I have become. None of them did, and I had every intention of keeping it that way. The next 4 years were the years of quiet construction. I want to describe them carefully because the temptation, when you are telling a story like this, is to compress the hard parts, to skip from the beginning of the work to the recognition of the work as if the middle were just a waiting room. The middle was not a waiting room. The middle was the whole thing. I left Millbrook Regional in the spring after a targeted approach to a position I had spent 18 months preparing for, Systems Integration Manager at Carver Holloway Medical Center, a 500-bed tertiary care facility that was, at the time, in the early stages of a major electronic health records transition. This was 2015. Hospital EHR transitions were, in 2015, one of the most consistently mismanaged processes in healthcare administration. The literature on failed implementations was extensive, and the pattern was almost always the same: technology vendors overselling capability, clinical staff undertrained on adoption, and operations managers who understood workflow in theory but had never mapped a single patient pathway from intake to discharge. I had mapped patient pathways. I had spent 4 years at Millbrook doing exactly that. I understood the gap between what EHR systems promised and what they actually delivered into the daily functioning of a hospital floor, and I understood it not from the vendor's documentation, but from the medical records and workflow data of a real institution. That understanding was, I had come to recognize, a specific and genuinely rare competency. The hiring committee at Carver Holloway knew it too. I received an offer within 3 weeks of my first interview. The EHR transition project at Carver Holloway took 26 months. We went live on the new system, MedCore Alliance, version 4.2, on March 14, 2017, which was 11 days ahead of the project schedule I had inherited and $218,000 under the original implementation budget. The chief medical officer at the time, Dr. Priscilla Nakamura-Wells, sent me a handwritten note the morning of the go-live. I still have it. It says, "Renata, this building has been trying to do this for 6 years. You did it in 2. PNW." I framed that note. I hung it in the office I kept at home, not at work, at home in the room where I kept everything that mattered: the framed degrees, the Gerald Tao plaque, and the folded piece of paper from my wallet, which I had finally unfolded and smoothed flat and pinned to the corkboard above my desk, because the $11,000 was no longer a wound I was holding. It was a number I had already outlasted, several times over. At Carver Holloway, I worked alongside a woman who became one of the most important professional relationships of my career: Simone Ake-Blorent, Senior Director of Clinical Partnerships. Simone had been in hospital administration for 16 years and had a quality I have rarely encountered in people at her level. She was genuinely interested in other people's thinking. Not as a social performance. Genuinely interested. She would stop you in the hallway and ask what you were working on and then actually listen to the answer, and then, sometimes days later, come back with a thought that showed she had been sitting with your answer since the conversation. Simone knew my full story within 6 months of us working together. Not because I told it, I did not tell it, but because she asked the right questions and I trusted her with the honest answers. "Your family doesn't know you're here," she said once. It was not a question. "They know I work in healthcare administration," I said. "That's all they need." She looked at me with an expression I could not entirely read. "That's not about protecting them," she said. "No," I agreed. "It's not." She nodded and did not press further, which was exactly right. Simone understood the architecture of certain silences. It was Simone who introduced me to Marcus Finley Cross, a family law attorney at the firm of Brenner, Holloway and Finch, when a situation arose with my father's estate. A situation I had not anticipated, and which required, for the first time in years, an attorney who could navigate both an inheritance dispute and the particular complications of a family that had, for 20 years, operated on the assumption that I was the least consequential person in it. Marcus Finley Cross was methodical, thorough, and disinclined to make promises he could not keep, which made him the right person for what was coming. I met with him for the first time in April of 2018. He reviewed the relevant documents: the will, the trust documents my father had set up before his death, and the financial disclosure my mother had provided to the estate, and he said, very calmly, "You have standing. The question is whether you want to use it." I told him I would let him know. The estate matter resolved itself, eventually, in a way that did not require a court order, which was the outcome I had preferred, and the one Marcus had told me was achievable if I was patient. The settlement was not the point. What the settlement represented was the point. It was the first time in 20 years that my family had been required, by the structure of a formal legal process, to account for my existence in the room. I walked out of the final meeting on a Tuesday afternoon in November and drove directly to my apartment and sat in my car for 22 minutes and let myself feel whatever it was I was feeling, which was not triumph exactly and was not relief exactly, but was something that sat between them. The particular satisfaction of a person who has been told for years that a thing is impossible and has simply continued doing the thing anyway. Simone called that evening. "How did it go?" she said. "It went," I said. "Good enough," she said. By the time the merger between Carver Holloway and Brightstone Healthcare was announced in the spring of 2019, I had been named Senior Director of Integrated Care Operations at the newly consolidated Northeast Regional Hub, a role that did not yet officially exist, because the organizational chart for the merged entity was still being drawn, but for which I had been specifically tapped by Dr. Nakamura Wells, who had moved into the Chief Operating Officer position at Brightstone 6 months earlier and had apparently told the Integration Committee, in terms I was later informed were unambiguous, "I need Renata Voss running the operational systems of this merger. She is not negotiable." I was 41 years old. I had spent 17 years building something that my family had told me, in a kitchen in Garrison Falls, was beyond my reach. I had a title, a department, a team of 23 people, and a mandate that would require every skill I had developed across every position I had held since the year I drove 4 hours to an admitted student's weekend in a car with no heat. I had a specialist appointment on my calendar for the morning after the formal announcement. Routine, a follow-up I had been scheduling around for months, and I remember sitting in the waiting room of Dr. Annika Subramaniam's office, a clinical cardiologist I saw annually because cardiac history runs in my family, and looking at the form they had handed me, the one asking for insurance policy information, primary coverage, secondary coverage, and filling it out with the same focused attention I had given to every other form and document and spreadsheet and contract in the previous 17 years. Health insurance coverage, physician of record, policy number. I filled in every field. Then I put my pen down and I looked out the window at the parking lot and I thought about Claudette, who had no idea. About my mother, who had no idea. About a decade and a half of construction that had happened entirely outside their line of sight. Danielle Marsh, who had been my most junior trainee at Millbrook Regional 7 years earlier, and had followed a career path that intersected with mine through 2 subsequent institutions, had been named director of the newly formed $37 million Integrated Patient Services Department that was, on paper, adjacent to my operational domain. She had a grant, a title, and the kind of confidence that sometimes forms in people who have never had to earn a thing incrementally. She had been my trainee. I had mentored her through her first vendor negotiation. I had taught her the medical records reconciliation process that she was now responsible for managing at scale. I had given her, without hesitation, the professional guidance that had helped shape the career that had just been handed a $37 million mandate. 2 days after the organizational chart was distributed, she called me into her new office, the one with the glass walls overlooking the Northeast Hub's main corridor, and slid a memo across the desk. Filing Coordinator, Grade II. I read it twice. Then I looked up at her and she said, with the tone of someone who had rehearsed the phrase, "It's a restructuring decision, nothing personal." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, "Of course," and I picked up the memo and I folded it in half and I walked out. I had her first major client presentation on my personal calendar because I had built the client relationships it was based on. I held the system access codes she would need to run the accompanying data demonstration. I knew the medical records retrieval protocol that the client, a regional insurance consortium reviewing their specialist appointment and coverage infrastructure, would expect to see demonstrated in real time. I knew these things because I had built them, piece by piece, in the years before Danielle Marsh had arrived. That Thursday night, I sat in my home office, the one with the framed certifications, and I watched her name light up my phone. 11:47 p.m. I had come that close to everything surfacing before it was time, but it wasn't time yet. When the second call came, 4 minutes after the first, I set the phone face down on the desk and I opened my laptop instead. There was an email I had been drafting to Marcus Finley Cross at Brenner, Holloway and Finch that I had been composing in my head for approximately 48 hours. The subject line was a single question. The body of the email was 3 paragraphs, each one precise, each one referencing a specific document, a specific date, a specific figure. I had not sent it yet because I had learned over 22 years that the timing of a thing matters as much as the thing itself. I read it through one more time, then I sent it. Then I closed the laptop and I sat in the quiet of my home office, surrounded by 17 years of invisible work, and I waited for morning. Marcus replied to my email at 6:14 the following morning. I know this because I was already awake, already at my desk, already reviewing the organizational documentation I had requested from Brightstone's HR integration team 3 days before the merger finalized, documents I had requested in my capacity as Senior Director of Integrated Care Operations, which was still, regardless of any memo Danielle Marsh had issued from her glass-walled office, my actual title in the institution's founding charter. Marcus's email was 4 sentences. The first sentence confirmed he had reviewed the materials I attached. The second sentence named a specific provision in the merger agreement. The third sentence said, "Your standing is clear, call me at 8. I called him at 8. He was already in his office at Brenner, Holloway and Finch, which I had come to understand was simply how Marcus Finleycross operated, early, prepared, and disinclined to waste either of our time. He had spent 23 years as an attorney navigating the overlap between institutional employment law and the particular complications that arise when a merger redraws an organizational chart in ways that contradict pre-existing agreements. He knew this terrain the way I knew vendor contracts and care coordination pathways, from the inside out, from the actual documents, not from the summary. The demotion memo, he said, references a restructuring decision. Is there a restructuring plan on file with the Merger Integration Committee? Not a finalized one, I said. I have the draft framework. My name does not appear in it. There was a brief pause. Your name does not appear in a restructuring framework for a department you were tapped to lead by the Chief Operating Officer. That is correct. Another pause. Renata, he said, with the particular quietness of a person whose mind is moving faster than his voice, I need you to send me the original appointment communication from Dr. Nakamura Wells, the one that preceded the organizational chart. I had already attached it to the email I sent the night before. It's in the documents, I said. I heard him scrolling. Then, right. Yes, another pause. I need 2 days. I told him he had them. What Marcus did not yet know, what I had not yet told him, because the timing was not right, was that the client presentation Danielle had been preparing to run that Thursday night was built on a framework I had developed 18 months earlier, a care coordination methodology I had documented, named, and submitted through Carver Holloway's internal innovation process. The methodology had a submission date. It had a document number. It existed in the medical records management system, with my name attached to it as originating author, because I had been meticulous about that kind of documentation for exactly the reason that documentation eventually becomes evidence. I had learned this from Gerald Tao, who had learned it from 21 years of watching things go wrong in institutions that did not write things down. The thing about Danielle Marsh, and I want to be fair to her here, because fairness requires accuracy and accuracy requires saying this, is that she was not incompetent. She was talented in specific ways and poorly positioned in others, and what had happened to her in the structure of the merger was that she had been handed a mandate that exceeded her operational experience by approximately 4 years. She knew this. I think she had known it the moment she signed the offer letter. And I think the demotion memo was not, at its core, about me. It was about her fear and what she had decided to do with it. That does not make the memo less of what it was, but it explains the phone calls. I was thinking about this the following Tuesday morning when I walked into the quarterly integration steering committee meeting, the one Danielle now nominally chaired, and took a seat at the table. She looked at me when I walked in. I could see her recalibrating something quickly behind her expression. Renata, she said, I wasn't sure you'd be attending this one. I was invited, I said. By the committee charter. Senior directors of operations retain standing committee participation through the transition period. It's in the merger agreement, section 4, paragraph 9. She looked at the person to her left, who was James Whitmore, vice president of integration strategy, and who had the expression of someone who had already read section 4, paragraph 9, and was now very interested in the surface of the conference table. I sat down and I opened my folder and I did not say anything else. What Danielle did not know, as that meeting proceeded, was that Marcus Finleycross had already made his first call to Brightstone's general counsel's office at 8:45 that morning. The following Thursday, 8 days after the demotion memo, 6 days after I sent the email to Marcus, I received a phone call from my mother. This was unusual. My mother called on birthdays and holidays, and occasionally on Sunday afternoons when Claudette was busy, and she wanted someone to talk to about her garden. She did not call on Thursdays in November. She called to tell me that she had been going through my father's papers. This was not the first time she had used this phrase as a preamble. My father had been gone for 11 years, and his papers were apparently an inexhaustible resource, and that she had found documentation related to a savings account he had set up before he died. She said the documentation suggested the account had been split into two portions. She said Claudette thought I should know about it. She said Claudette thought. I sat with that for exactly 1 second. What kind of account? I said. Some kind of trust arrangement, my mother said. I don't really understand it. Claudette thinks it might be connected to the estate matter from a few years back. The estate matter from a few years back was the matter Marcus Finley Cross had resolved in November 2018 in a settlement that had been documented, signed, and witnessed. The trust documents my father had established had been fully reviewed and accounted for in that process. If there was additional documentation my mother was now finding, there were two possibilities. Either it was irrelevant to the settled matter, or someone had not fully disclosed everything during the financial disclosure process that preceded the settlement. I knew which one I thought was more likely. Can you scan it and send it to me? I said. Claudette thought maybe we should all sit down, my mother said. The three of us, talk it through as a family. Talk it through as a family. I looked out my window at the parking structure adjacent to the northeast hub. I watched a woman in green scrubs cross the elevated walkway between the main building and the surgical wing. I thought about the conversation at my mother's kitchen table 22 years ago, and about the particular architecture of how my family had always used the phrase as a family, always in situations where the outcome they wanted had already been decided, and the family meeting was the theater in which it was announced. Of course, I said. Let's set something up. Claudette is free Saturday, my mother said. Saturday works, I said. I hung up and I sat still for approximately 30 seconds. Then I called Marcus. The trust documents, I said when he picked up. There's more. He was quiet for a moment. How much more? I don't know yet, she's sending them. When she sends them, he said, forward them directly to me before you read them yourself. I want to see them cold. That was the moment I understood exactly how much they had underestimated me. The documents arrived by email Friday morning. I forwarded them to Marcus without opening the attachments. Then I made a specialist appointment, the follow-up with Dr. Subramaniam that I had been rescheduling for 3 weeks, and I drove across town and sat in a waiting room and read a magazine article about container gardening, which is not something I have ever done or plan to do, and I let Marcus do what I had paid him to do. He called me at 2 in the afternoon. There is a secondary account, he said. That was not disclosed in the 2018 financial disclosure. I said nothing. The account was established in 2004, he said. The terms of the trust documents name both you and Claudette as equal beneficiaries. The current value, he paused, and I heard paper moving, is $412,000. I sat in the parking structure outside Dr. Subramaniam's office building, and I held the phone against my ear, and I looked at the concrete pillar in front of my car, which had a yellow stripe painted on it and a number, 17, stenciled in black, and I thought, my father set aside $412,000 for me and my sister has been managing the account since his death, and the 2018 settlement was negotiated without this account on the table. What does this mean for the settlement? I said. It means the settlement was based on an incomplete financial disclosure, Marcus said, which means we go back. I called Simone Ake-Blorent that evening. She was at home. I could hear what sounded like a documentary about migratory birds in the background. I told her what Marcus had told me. She listened without interrupting, which was characteristic of her, and when I finished she was quiet for a moment. How are you? She said. I'm fine, I said. Renata. I stopped. I thought about my father, who had been a quiet man with a careful mind and a habit of setting things aside for later, and who had apparently tried to set something aside for me, and what had happened to it in the years since. I'm steadier than I expected to be, I said. I think because this confirms something I already knew, that they took what wasn't theirs. That they made a decision, I said, that I am now in a position to revisit. Simone was quiet for another moment. Then she said, Marcus is good. He's very good, I said, and you have everything documented. I have everything documented, I said. The medical records of my father's final hospitalization, which I had obtained through the proper records request process 3 years earlier for reasons I had told myself were personal and now understood were also practical. The original will. the trust documents from 2018, and now, the trust documents from 2004 that had not appeared in the 2018 financial disclosure. I had, as Marcus had said when we first met, standing. The question remained whether I wanted to use it. I had made my decision. What I had not yet decided was the setting. Marcus filed the motion to reopen the estate matter on a Wednesday morning in December, which meant that by the time I sat down with my mother and Claudette on Saturday, the family meeting my mother had proposed, the one where Claudette would present whatever version of the account she had prepared, there was already a filed motion in the relevant county court that Claudette had not yet been notified of, because the notification had been sent to an address that required one additional business day to process. I want to be accurate about this. I did not plan the timing to be cruel. I planned it because Marcus had advised that filing before the family meeting gave us a specific procedural advantage, and I had trusted his judgment, and his judgment had been correct. But I am also aware that the effect, sitting across from Claudette at my mother's kitchen table with the knowledge of what had been filed while she prepared to tell me her version of events, was not an accident. I made a choice. I am being honest about that. The kitchen had been renovated again since 2002. The table was different, larger, marble-topped, the kind of table that costs more than $11,000. Claudette sat across from me in a cream-colored sweater and set a folder on the table with the deliberateness of someone who had choreographed this moment in advance. My mother sat at the head between us with her hands folded. "Thank you for coming," Claudette said. "Of course," I said. "Found these documents," Claudette said, opening the folder, "and we thought it was important to discuss them as a family." She slid a page across the table. It was a printout of the account summary. "As you can see, Dad set up this account in 2004. It was designed as a long-term savings vehicle for both of us. The account has been," she paused just slightly, "managed carefully over the years." "Managed by whom?" I said. "I've been the named account manager since 2009, she said. "Dad asked me to handle it because I had more financial experience at the time." I looked at the page. "And this wasn't included in the 2018 estate settlement," I said. Claudette's hands, which were resting on the folder, went very still. "The 2018 matter was separate," she said. "That related to the house and the primary accounts. This was a different instrument." "A trust document," I said. "A savings vehicle." "A trust document," I said again, pleasantly, naming me as an equal beneficiary, which would make it relevant to a comprehensive financial disclosure in an estate settlement. My mother made a small sound. Claudette looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. It was not anger. It was the specific quality of attention a person gives to a situation they are realizing has changed shape. "Renata," she said, and her voice was different now, careful in a way it had never been before when she spoke to me. "I think there may have been an oversight." "I think so too," I said. I kept my hands flat on the table. I looked at her steadily. "Marcus Finley Cross at Brenner, Holloway and Finch filed a motion this week to revisit the estate settlement in light of the additional documents. You'll be receiving notification at your home address. I wanted you to hear it from me first." Claudette opened her mouth. Then she closed it. Then she opened it again and said, in a voice that was considerably quieter than any voice she had ever used with me in this kitchen, "You already filed." "Yes," I said. My mother made the small sound again and looked at her hands. "I want you to know," I said, "that this is not about the money, it's about the record. Our father wanted this account to benefit both of us equally. That's what the trust documents say. I want the record to reflect what he intended." Claudette looked at me for a long time. She thought she had walked me into a conversation she had prepared. She had 2 more days before she would have understood how wrong she was. She had less than 2 minutes. "We should discuss this with attorneys present," she said finally. "Agreed," I said. "Marcus will be in touch." I stood up. I put on my coat. My mother looked up at me and I thought I saw, for just a moment, something complicated in her face. Not guilt exactly, not acknowledgement exactly, but the look of a person who is beginning to understand the distance between what they believed was true and what was actually true, and finding that distance larger than expected. "Drive safe, Mom," I said. I drove back to the Northeast Hub. I had a report to review before Monday, and I sat in my office in the quiet of a Saturday afternoon, and I thought about my father and what he had meant to set aside for me, and I let myself feel the full weight of that for exactly as long as I needed to. The formal hearing on the estate matter was scheduled for a Tuesday in February at the Garrison County Probate Court, in a room that was smaller than I expected and more procedurally exacting than Claudette had apparently anticipated. I know this because when I arrived with Marcus, and with the complete documentation we had assembled, which included the original trust documents, the 2018 financial disclosure, the account records, and 3 years of account management decisions made without my knowledge or consent, Claudette was already seated beside her own attorney, a man named Robert Spear, who had the expression of someone who had reviewed the opposing documentation the previous week and had subsequently had a difficult conversation with his client about the meaning of the word disclosure. The room was not large, but it was full. Claudette's husband Marcus, not to be confused with Marcus Finley Cross, which has always struck me as an organizational inconvenience, sat in the gallery. 2 Brightstone colleagues of mine attended as character witnesses. Simone Aikblorent, who sat in the second row and looked exactly like the most composed person in any room she entered, and Dr. Priscilla Nakamura-Wells, who had taken time from her schedule as Chief Operating Officer to appear in person, which I had not asked her to do, and which she had done anyway because, as she told me the morning before, "You have been one of the most meticulous and honest operators I have worked with in 27 years of healthcare administration. And if a probate judge needs to hear that, I will tell him." I had not expected her to say that. I sat with it for a moment before I could respond. The hearing opened at 9. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Diana Mbeki Strauss, who had been on the probate bench for 14 years, and who proceeded with the particular economy of motion belonging to someone who had reviewed the case materials thoroughly and arrived at the hearing already oriented. Marcus Finley Cross presented our documentation in 4 phases. The first was the original trust document from 2004, my father's handwriting on the intent page, the account structure, the equal beneficiary designation naming both Claudette and me. He passed copies to opposing counsel and to the judge. Judge Mbeki Strauss reviewed it for approximately 90 seconds. She looked up at Robert Spear. "Counsel, is the existence of this instrument disputed?" Spear said it was not. "Then we proceed to the disclosure question," the judge said. "That was the first document. I had 3 more. The second was the 2018 financial disclosure, the document submitted during the original estate settlement, listing the assets under consideration." Marcus placed it beside the 2004 trust document and indicated item by item that the account was absent, not mischaracterized, not ambiguously categorized, absent. Claudette looked at the marble surface of the table in front of her. Her hands went to her lap. Marcus continued. The third document was the account activity record for the period between 2009, when Claudette became the named account manager, and the present. It showed, across 14 years, 23 withdrawals for purposes that did not align with the trust's stated investment mandate. The withdrawals totaled, collectively, $187,400. Spear objected on technical grounds. Judge Mbeki Strauss overruled him without looking up from the document. Claudette turned to Spear and said something in a voice too low to hear. He shook his head very slightly. She looked back at the table. "The fourth document," Marcus said, with the measured cadence that was his professional signature, "is a letter from Renata Voss to her father, dated October 2003. In this letter, written when she was 25 years old and preparing to apply to graduate programs, Ms. Voss references a conversation with her father in which he told her he was setting aside funds to ensure that both his daughters had resources to pursue their ambitions. She thanks him for that conversation. She did not know, at the time of writing, the specific account he was referring to. She learned the specific amount last November. Judge Mbeki Strauss looked at me. I looked back at her. "Ms. Voss," she said, "you've been Senior Director of Integrated Care Operations at Brightstone Healthcare's Northeast Regional Hub." "I have," I said. "For how long?" 11 months in the merged entity, 17 years in the field." She nodded once. She looked back at the documents. "Mr. Spear," she said, "does your client wish to contest the account activity record?" Spear consulted with Claudette in a whispered exchange that lasted 45 seconds. During those 45 seconds, I looked at Simone in the second row. She met my eyes. She gave me one small, deliberate nod. Spear said his client did not contest the record. "Then here is where we are," Judge Mbeki Strauss said. She folded her hands and looked at the room with the specific quality of attention that communicates that what is about to be said is the end of discussion. The trust document of 2004 is valid and binding. Its omission from the 2018 financial disclosure is material. The undisclosed account, valued at its current amount of $412,000, is subject to the equal beneficiary terms of the trust. Additionally, the withdrawals made by the named account manager without the knowledge or consent of the co-beneficiary represent a breach of fiduciary duty as defined under state probate code. The court will issue a formal order requiring full restitution to Ms. Renata Voss of her share of the original account value as of the date of her father's death, plus interest accrued at the statutory rate, adjusted for documented withdrawals. She paused. The total amount will be calculated by the court-appointed financial examiner and presented in the final order within 30 days. The 2018 settlement is hereby reopened for revision consistent with today's findings. Claudette made a sound. Not a word, a sound. The specific sound of a sentence that was fully formed inside someone and then did not make it out. Her husband from the gallery said her name once quietly. Robert Spear began writing. I sat very still. I did not feel triumphant. This is important to say because the story would be simpler if I did, if there had been a wave of satisfaction at the moment the gavel came down, or whatever version of finality a probate proceeding offers. What I felt was something quieter and more structural, the feeling of a record being corrected. Of a document that had said one thing now being amended to say what was actually true. My father had set aside money for both of his daughters. The court had affirmed that. That was what mattered. Marcus gathered the documents with the deliberateness he brought to everything. Outside the courtroom, in the narrow hallway with its institutional light and its tile floor, he shook my hand. That was clean, he said, which from Marcus was a full paragraph. Dr. Nakamura Wells found me near the exit. She put one hand briefly on my arm and said, Your father would have been pleased. Then she walked to the elevator because she had a board meeting at 11 and Priscilla Nakamura Wells was never late to a board meeting. Simone walked out with me. We stood on the courthouse steps in February air, which in Garrison County means cold with a particular quality of finality, like the end of a long document. How do you feel? She said. I thought about it. Finished, I said. Not in a bad way. The way a project feels when it's actually done, she smiled. What about Danielle? Danielle Marsh. I had not forgotten about Danielle Marsh. I had simply allowed the matters to proceed in their own sequence, because I had learned, over 17 years, that sequence is everything. The situation at Brightstone had resolved 2 weeks before the hearing, in a meeting I had not attended, but had been briefed on by James Whitmore, VP of Integration Strategy, who had the expression of a man who had spent several difficult days understanding the nature of a specific error. Marcus Finley Cross's inquiry to the General Counsel's office had initiated an internal review of the merger's organizational documentation. The review had confirmed, in writing, with signatures, that my original appointment as Senior Director of Integrated Care Operations predated the merger finalization and had been specifically structured in the pre-merger agreement as a protected role. The demotion memo had no procedural standing. It was rescinded, formally. In a memo on Brightstone letterhead that used the word rescinded 4 times, which I thought was 1 time more than necessary but appreciated nonetheless. Danielle retained her title as Director of Integrated Patient Services. That department was real, and the work it was meant to do was real, and I had no interest in dismantling something that could function well under the right conditions. What changed was the reporting structure. Danielle's department reported through mine. This was, as James Whitmore explained it to her, a natural alignment given the operational dependencies between the two functions. I was told she did not respond to this explanation for approximately 20 seconds. I never called her back. I want to address that directly because it is the most morally complex thing I did in this sequence of events, and I believe it deserves an honest accounting. I did not call her back on that Thursday night because I understood that the favor she was asking, run the presentation, save my first client meeting, step back into the role you've always occupied in relation to me, was a continuation of the dynamic that the memo had made official. I did not call her back because answering that call would have told her something false, that the relationship between us was still structured the way she had decided it was when she slid that memo across the desk. She ran the presentation without me. I don't know how it went. I chose not to ask. What I know is that 6 weeks later, she knocked on my office door, my actual office, the one I returned to the Monday after the internal review concluded, and stood in the doorway for a moment before she said, I made a mistake. I said, come in. We had a conversation. It was not comfortable and it was not short and it covered some things that needed covering. At the end of it I said, "You're talented, Danielle. You're not ready for what they handed you, but that's not entirely your doing. Do the work. I'll support the department when the work warrants it." She nodded. She looked like someone who had been set down after being carried too high. She left. I returned to my report. My life now is quieter than this story might suggest. I hold the same title. The Northeast Hub has grown. We absorbed a third regional partner in the fall, which added 11 departments and 432 staff members to the operational infrastructure I oversee. I have a team I trust. Simone Aikblorent became Deputy Director of Strategic Partnerships at Brightstone the same month the estate order was finalized, which means I see her at integration meetings and occasionally for dinner on Thursday evenings, where we talk about work and birds and container gardening, because Simone has, in fact, taken up container gardening and is distressingly good at it. My mother called me in March, 3 weeks after the probate hearing. She did not mention the hearing. She talked about her garden, and about a documentary she had watched, and about the fact that Claudette's kitchen renovation had been delayed. At the end of the call she said, very quietly, "Your father always said you were the one who paid attention." I held the phone and looked at the wall above my desk, the framed degrees, the Gerald Tao plaque, the letter from Dr. Nakamura Wells, and the piece of paper, smoothed flat and pinned level, with 3 things written on it in my own handwriting from 22 years ago. "I know," I said. "I do not have a simple feeling about my mother. I suspect I never will, and I have made a kind of peace with the complexity of that. She is a woman who made choices that caused harm, and she is also a woman who is 71 years old and sat in a kitchen chair, and told me my father said I was the one who paid attention. These things are both true at the same time, and the work of holding them both without resolving them into something tidier is, I think, the actual ongoing work of this story. Not the hearing. Not the memo. Not the phone call I didn't answer. The ongoing work is living without the need for a verdict from people who never understood what they were judging. And if there's anything this experience taught me, it's this. 1. What you build in silence cannot be dismantled by people who never saw the foundation. They can challenge the surface, but the structure belongs to you. 2. Documentation is not distrust, it is respect for the truth, and the day will come when the truth requires a paper trail to stand in a room and be recognized. 3. Your identity was never theirs to define, it was only ever yours to demonstrate, and the demonstration does not require their presence or their approval to be complete. Was I wrong to let that phone ring unanswered, to sit in my office, knowing Danielle was panicking, knowing I had everything she needed, and to choose silence over rescue? Tell me in the comments. If this story gave you strength, hit that like button. It means more than you know.